Hey there, friends. Tonight, we're going to slow things down once again. Find a quiet space, pull the blanket up just a little higher, and let the soft hum of the room settle around you. Maybe you're listening while drifting off, or maybe you're tucked away in your own little corner of the world, searching for something steady to ease into sleep. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, welcome. Tonight's story is a heavy one. Quiet, but heavy. It's not about war or kings, not about knights or castles. It's about ordinary people, families, townsfolk, farmers, traders, priests, children, people who lived hundreds of years ago and faced one of the most terrifying chapters in human history. We're going back to the 14th century, to a time when the world changed forever, a time when something invisible began to spread, something that didn't make a sound, didn't carry a sword, didn't speak any warnings, and yet it crept into towns, over hills, across oceans, and took nearly everything with it. The Black Death. It's a phrase you've probably heard before, one of those things they taught us in school, somewhere between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But behind that name, behind those dusty textbook words, is a real story, a deeply human one full of fear, survival, small kindnesses, desperate choices, and a kind of resilience that echoes quietly across time. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a test of faith, of endurance, of everything people thought they knew about the world. But tonight, we're not just here to talk about the numbers or the death toll. We're here to understand how people survived, because not everyone perished. Some did live, and not just by luck. They adapted, they hid, they tried, and somehow, some way, they made it through. So before we begin this long journey, take a second, breathe in and out. Let go of the day behind you. Let the candlelight of imagination flicker softly. Let the voices of the past settle in beside you. Now, I won't jump into the science just yet. We'll get to what the plague really was, how it spread, what it did to the body, and how people misunderstood it. But for now, I want to help you feel it, the way it must have felt then. It's the year 1346. Europe is full of sound, hammers in the market, church bells in the square, horse hooves on dirt roads, laughter, songs, fires crackling in hearths, bread baking, sheep bleating, life simple and familiar. But across the sea, something is stirring. A sickness, a silence, a shadow growing darker. You wouldn't know it yet. Not in England, not in France, not in the Holy Roman Empire, not in Norway or Hungary or Spain. Not yet, but the winds were already shifting. Caravans from the east, ships from the Black Sea, fleas clinging to rats, rats hiding in barrels, barrels loaded onto ships, and the ships bound for the coasts of Europe. The world was already changing, and no one knew. If you were alive then, a regular person, a baker's daughter, a town crier, a tired old farmer who just finished stacking firewood, you wouldn't have seen it coming. One day, you'd hear a rumor from travelers. A distant port closed, a crew found dead, and then, a week or two later, someone in your village might cough and not stop. By the time people realized something was wrong, it was already far too late. But here's the thing. We often talk about plagues as unstoppable forces, and yes, this one came fast. It killed faster. But people, despite everything, didn't just roll over and give up. They resisted. They panicked. They prayed. They experimented. They built barriers. They changed how they lived, how they cooked, how they traveled, how they cared for the sick, and for each other. Some even disappeared into the wilderness, believing isolation was the only way to survive. And somehow, some of them were right. This story isn't about doom. It's about what's left after. It's about survival in the unlikeliest of places, in makeshift shelters, in whispered prayers, in hidden herbs and strange customs. It's about the quiet power of people just trying to live another day, and how, even in the face of unthinkable loss, they did. Now, before we settle fully into this story, if you're still awake with me, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you want to join more of these deep, quiet dives into history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing that little map of listeners light up across the world. It reminds me we're all still connected, even now, through story. Tonight, I want you to drift gently, not just into sleep, but into the memory of a time long past. You're going to learn, softly, slowly, about how people clung to life during the worst pandemic in history. What they ate, what they feared, where they went, how they held on to hope, and why some survived, while others didn't. We'll talk about the plague itself. We'll walk the crooked alleyways of shuttered cities. We'll meet herbalists, monks, gravediggers, desperate mothers, traveling doctors. We'll wander into superstition and ceremony, and into the silence that followed. But for now, just rest. Know that the story you're about to hear is real, that people really lived through it, and that somewhere in the quiet places of history, their voices still echo. Let's begin. You're lying there, wrapped in warmth, eyes beginning to flutter, and the world is starting to blur just a little at the edges. But now, the story deepens. Let's take our first real step into the heart of it. The Black Death. A name so heavy it seems to carry its own gravity. But what was it, really? To us today, with microscopes and science and germ theory, it's a disease with a name. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rats. To people in the 14th century, it was something far worse. It was unknowable, untouchable, unseeable. A punishment, a curse, a demon, a poison in the air. It was, in every sense, a mystery. Let's pull back the veil. What we now call the Black Death was a pandemic of bubonic plague that swept through Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the mid-13th centuries. It's estimated that it killed between 75 to 200 million people worldwide, an almost unfathomable number. In Europe alone, it may have wiped out up to 60% of the population in just a few years. It came in waves, and it wasn't just one form. There was bubonic plague, which affected the lymph nodes, pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and spread through coughs, and septicemic plague, the deadliest of all, killing often within a day, turning blood to poison. But this understanding, comes with centuries of hindsight. Let's go back again, back to before it had a name. A long journey from the east. The plague didn't start in Europe. Its roots can be traced back to the steppes of Central Asia, in the region we now know as Mongolia. There, the bacterium lived quietly in the fleas of wild rodents, marmots primarily, and for a long time, it stayed more or less contained. But something shifted. The 1300s were a time of movement. Trade routes like the Silk Road were alive with the exchange of goods: silk, spices, metalwork, glass, ivory, and with that came travelers, soldiers, merchants, and animals. The Mongol Empire had opened up connections across continents, creating a vast living web that tied together China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. In 1346, the first major outbreak of what would become the Black Death exploded in Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the coast of the Black Sea, present-day Feodosia in Crimea. Here's where it gets chilling. Kaffa was under siege by the Mongols, who, according to some sources, were already dying from the plague. In a grim moment of early biological warfare, it's said they catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, spreading the disease to those inside. Genoese merchants fled by ship, carrying more than silk and spices. They carried death. Those ships arrived in Messina, Sicily, in 1347. When they docked, the crew was either already dead or dying. The town officials tried to quarantine the vessels, but it was too late. The sickness had already reached shore. The invisible fire. From there, it spread like wildfire, not in days but in months and years. Across Italy, to Genoa, Venice, Florence, then France, Spain, England, Germany, Norway. It moved faster than anyone could believe, and no one understood why. To the people of the time, it was as though the air itself had changed. They called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence. Later, the Black Death, referring possibly to the blackened buboes, swollen lymph nodes, or to the dark mood that fell over entire continents. Imagine being a mother in a small town far from the coast. You hear rumors, ships falling silent, priests collapsing in pulpits. You say a prayer and go about your chores. Then a neighbor falls ill. Fever, chills, vomiting, strange black swellings. By morning, they're dead. The next day, 2 more. Then 5. Then the whole street. You stop asking what's happening. You start asking, who will be next? How it actually spread. Let's take a gentle pause here and breathe into what's real. What we know now is that the plague was largely spread through fleas, specifically the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chiapis. These fleas lived on black rats, which were very common in Europe's cities, ships, homes, and marketplaces. The fleas would bite an infected rat, pick up the bacteria, and then bite a human, passing the disease along. But it wasn't just through bites. In the pneumonic form, the plague became airborne, spread through coughing or sneezing. It could now move person to person, with no need for rats or fleas at all. Add to that the movement of armies, pilgrims, merchants, and refugees, and the disease became unstoppable. People would flee cities, hoping to escape. But in doing so, they often carried the disease with them, introducing it to every village, every stop, every quiet corner they ran to. It was like trying to outrun smoke. No matter how far you ran, the air followed. What they thought it was. And here's where it becomes heartbreakingly human. People in the 14th century had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 500 years. So they turned to what they knew. God, sin, astrology, air, and balance. One of the most popular beliefs was miasma, the idea that disease came from bad air. People burned herbs, incense, and aromatic resins to purify their homes. They clutched bouquets to their noses when walking outside. They sealed windows, lit fires. Some even believed that planetary alignment had cursed the earth. Others were sure it was divine punishment, a reckoning for sin. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public as penance. Priests held desperate masses. People prayed until they wept. Some believed it was caused by Jews poisoning wells, a lie that led to massacres and pogroms across Europe. Fear turned to blame. Blame turned to blood. In some towns, people thought the disease spread through the gaze of the sick, so windows were boarded. People avoided eye contact. Doors were marked. Families abandoned each other. Entire villages disappeared. all of this, from miasma to divine wrath to scapegoats, was how people tried to make sense of something they couldn't see. It's what humans do in the face of the unknowable. We reach for stories, and in this case, most of those stories were soaked in terror. The numbers no one could count. We often say 1/3 of Europe died, but that's just an estimate. In truth, no one really knows how many lives were lost. In some places, mortality may have been as high as 60 to 70%. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris lost half their populations within months. Imagine every second house on your street falling silent. Imagine 8 out of 10 friends gone. Imagine entire neighborhoods with no one left to bury the dead. But again, not everyone died. And that's where our story is headed next. The city gates are closed. The air is thick. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a church bell tolls. Again, no one bothers to count the rings anymore. Inside the walls, survival no longer means thriving. It simply means lasting until tomorrow. Let's go there now, into the narrow cobbled streets, behind the warped shutters, and through the half-empty market stalls. Let's see how, in a time of terror, people tried to hold on to life. Cities as death traps. To understand survival in the cities, we have to first understand what the cities were. In the 14th century, Europe's urban centers weren't built for breathing room. They were cramped, shadowed by timber-framed houses leaning inward, sometimes touching overhead. There was no organized sewage. Waste was thrown into the street. Animals, pigs, goats, chickens, shared space with people. Markets buzzed with life, but sanitation was virtually non-existent. These were perfect breeding grounds for plague-bearing rats and fleas, and once the sickness arrived in a city, it spread with terrifying speed. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio described corpses piling up in homes, in churches, even in the streets. In London, the death toll became so overwhelming that mass graves, plague pits, were dug to hold dozens, then hundreds of bodies. In these cities, the fight to survive wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. People had to navigate fear, misinformation, isolation, and desperation, all while watching their world crumble around them. The wealthy flee, the poor remain. One of the first patterns to emerge was this: the wealthy left. Those who could afford it, nobles, merchants, scholars, packed up their families and retinues and fled to country estates or rural villas. They believed that distance from the crowded, diseased cities would keep them safe. And in many cases, they were right. Boccaccio again gives us a glimpse. In the Decameron, he imagines a group of friends retreating to the countryside to tell stories and wait out the plague. This was a fantasy, of course, but it reflected a very real phenomenon. Survival, as always, was easier with privilege. For the poor, there was no such luxury. They stayed, they lived, and died in the alleys, in the cramped apartments, in the dark and the dirt. They took care of the sick because they had no choice. Some made money by burying the dead. Others became caretakers, nurses, or corpse collectors, not out of courage, but out of desperation. Many of them would not survive. And still, others tried to escape too, setting out on foot to nearby villages. But they were often met with closed gates and weapons drawn. Townsfolk feared what the refugees might bring with them. Many were turned back, left to wander, carrying disease and hunger in equal measure. Public health before science. So how did cities respond once the death toll became too high to ignore? Remarkably, some forms of public health did emerge, even before germ theory was understood. The city of Venice, for example, was one of the first to implement organized quarantines. The word quarantine itself comes from 40 giorni, 40 days. The period ships had to wait offshore before unloading cargo or passengers. It wasn't based on science, but observation. People who were isolated didn't seem to get sick, and so they were isolated longer. Venice even set up lazarettos, early plague hospitals located on islands, where the sick and dying could be housed away from the main population. Other cities began copying the model. Elsewhere, cities tried different, sometimes desperate, measures, shutting city gates and blocking trade routes, forcing sick families to stay inside, even boarding up their homes, hiring plague doctors, often with long-beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, more symbol than solution, burning infected homes and belongings, hoping to purge the sickness with flame, mandating the cleaning of streets, although by this point it was often too late. In some cases, local authorities, whether town councils or church leaders, simply collapsed under the weight of it all. With so many dead or fleeing, leadership fell apart. Still, here and there, cities made small, crucial decisions that saved lives, even if they didn't fully understand why. Medicine, mysticism, and misunderstanding. The doctors of the day were largely powerless. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and health was thought to depend on the balance between them. Illness, then, was an imbalance. Some physicians tried bloodletting, hoping to release the sickness. Others applied poultices made from herbs, vinegar, onions, or even crushed emeralds. Urine charts were consulted. Astrological alignments were blamed. Doctors advised avoiding baths, which were thought to open the pores to bad air, and warned against overindulgence, sex, or strong emotions. And when that didn't work, people turned to mysticism and miracle cures. Saints were prayed to, amulets were worn, holy water, pilgrimages, fasts, and even flagellation rituals were performed. And yet, in the middle of all this, a strange thing happened. Some people did survive. Often, these were the ones who kept away from the sick, those who managed to eat well, those who had good immune systems, those who, through luck or lifestyle or isolation, simply never came into contact with the plague. We now believe that genetics played a role too. Certain people had genetic variations that made them less susceptible to infection. Their descendants may still carry those traits today. Survival was part science, part chance, part sheer stubbornness. The city sounds changed. And still, as days turned into months, the very rhythm of the city changed. The markets fell silent. The bells tolled at odd hours. Children stopped playing in the streets. Even the animals seemed to sense it, wandering untended, some starving, others turning wild. There were no longer enough priests to give last rites, nor gravediggers to bury the bodies. Mass graves became the norm. Entire families disappeared. Shops closed. Doors were nailed shut. Some city quarters became ghost towns. And yet, not everything stopped. In places where the population dipped below critical mass, something strange happened. The disease began to fade. With fewer hosts, it had fewer places to go. Some cities began to stabilize, not heal, not yet. But pause. That pause gave the survivors time to crawl out, blinking, into the light. And when they did, they found that the city they knew was gone. What survival looked like. Really, let's linger here for a moment. Because when we say survived the plague, it's easy to imagine someone strong and healthy, walking confidently into the aftermath. But more often, survival looked like this. a woman who buried 4 children and now lives in silence, alone. A boy who fled the city and returned months later to find his street empty. A priest who continued giving last rites until no one came to Mass anymore. A merchant who once sold velvet and spices, now sweeping plague dust from a broken shop. To survive meant to endure loss on an unthinkable scale. To live meant to carry the weight of what had been lost. But live they did. And as the plague faded, those survivors became the builders of what came next. New laws, new customs, new prayers, new hopes. Cities began to open again, slowly. Markets stirred. Bells rang for weddings, not funerals. And the next time plague returned, which it would, many times, humanity would face it with a little more knowledge and a little more resolve. Outside the city walls, there are no tolling bells, no plague pits, no thick crowds pushing through narrow alleys. There's wind. There's the creak of wood carts. There's the rustle of leaves and the smell of earth. And yet, the Black Death was not a storm that stopped at the gates. The countryside may have looked peaceful, but it too was held hostage by death. Let's walk now, slowly, between the pastures and crumbling barns. Let's step into the farmsteads, along the muddy roads that snake between distant parishes and lonely monasteries. Let's see how people survived, or didn't, far from the cities, in a world where neighbors were few and fear had room to breathe. Rural life before the plague. To understand the rural experience of the Black Death, we first need to remember what peasant life was like before it began. The countryside of 14th century Europe was dominated by the manorial system. Vast tracts of land owned by lords, worked by peasants and serfs who owed rent or labor in return for a small plot and protection. Most people were bound to the land, not slaves exactly, but with little choice in where they lived or what they did. Their lives were seasonal, rhythmic, and hard. Spring brought planting, plowing, lambing. Summer was long days of weeding, harvesting hay, shearing sheep. Autumn was the grain harvest, slaughtering animals, preserving food. Winter was darkness, smoke, hunger, and prayer. Homes were made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs, 1 or 2 rooms at most. Families often lived in a single space with livestock nearby. Meals were coarse, bread, pottage, maybe a bit of salted pork or fish if they were lucky. The local village church was the heart of community life. So was the tavern, and everyone, from lord to swineherd, depended on the land. But land could not save them from what was coming. When the sickness came to the villages, unlike the cities, where the plague erupted like wildfire, in the countryside it moved like creeping fog, slow, patchy, and hard to predict. In some villages, the plague never arrived. In others, it came suddenly and left no one behind. Rural people, often isolated from outside news, didn't always understand what was happening. Word might spread that a nearby town was dying, or that travelers carried a curse. Sometimes, a merchant would arrive with rumors. Other times, sickness simply started. A cough, a fever, a neighbor gone by morning. Entire hamlets vanished. Sometimes the dead outnumbered the living. There were reports of villages where only children remained, confused and hungry, waiting for parents who would never return. In others, not a soul stirred. Homes overgrown with weeds, fires cold in their hearths. And in some cases, people simply walked away. They left their homes, their animals, their fields, and disappeared into the forests, hoping the trees might shelter them from what the earth had let loose. Fear in the fields. For peasants and rural families, fear took on a different shape than it did in the cities. There were no plague doctors here, no lazarettos, no quarantines enforced by guards. Instead, there was silence, and then the sudden sound of a cart, a knock at the door, or worse, no knock at all. Neighbors stopped visiting each other. Parishes lost their priests. Farms were left untended. Oxen wandered. Fields went to seed. The tools stayed leaning against walls, forgotten. Some villages held outdoor masses, spread apart in graveyards or pastures, hoping the open air might shield them. In others, superstition took root. People blamed comets seen earlier in the sky, witchcraft and cunning folk, Jews, heretics, or even their own sins, and many turned inward. Families hid in their own cottages, refusing to speak to those beyond their walls. Those who did venture out might cover their faces with cloth or herbs, or smear tar beneath their nostrils. It wasn't science, but it was something. Faith and folklore. Out here, away from the intellectual centers, faith and folklore blurred. Some villagers clung to the church. Others turned to ancient charms, whispered incantations, or left offerings at old stones and crossroads. It was a return to the old ways, pagan echoes layered beneath Christian belief. In the forests, there were tales of green women who stole children, or spirits who wandered at night seeking warm breath. Whether believed or not, the stories carried a lesson. Stay close to home, avoid the dark, and don't stray far when the world is sick. Holy relics were passed from hand to hand. Some believed certain springs could heal. Others walked miles barefoot, praying for deliverance. A few gave up entirely, not from disbelief, but from exhaustion. The survivor's luck and strategy. Here's the surprising part. Rural communities, especially isolated ones, sometimes fared better than cities. Why? Fewer people meant fewer vectors of disease. Less travel meant slower spread. Natural isolation acted like a crude quarantine. Villages that reacted quickly, barring outsiders, sharing food within, watching for early symptoms, could sometimes avoid devastation. Some lords closed their manors entirely, refusing entry to any outsider. Others built wooden barricades on roads or employed men to watch the paths. In England, for instance, the village of Eyam famously self-quarantined centuries later in 1665. But even during the Black Death, similar acts of community discipline may have occurred. And then, there were the practical skills rural people had. They grew their own food. They knew herbs and basic remedies. They butchered, cooked, preserved, and built. City dwellers relied on trade. Country folk relied on themselves. That self-sufficiency, paired with caution, saved lives. Aftermath, ghost villages, and new futures. When the plague wave passed, the countryside looked different. In some places, it was quiet. Farms returned to their rhythms. Children grew. Seeds were planted again. In others, it was haunted. Houses stood empty. Roofs collapsed. Fruit trees grew wild. The road that once saw wagons now saw moss. These were called deserted medieval villages, and archaeologists still study them today. Traces of walls, ditches, wells, and hearthstones, long abandoned. But the survivors, those who remained, found themselves with something rare: opportunity. With fewer workers, peasants could demand more wages, more freedom, and better living conditions. Labor shortages meant that serfdom weakened. Some moved into abandoned homes or claimed land once forbidden. The balance between lord and laborer began to tilt. Slowly. This was not yet revolution, but it was change. The very social order of medieval Europe would never fully recover from what the plague did in these fields and forests. The wind howls across the moors, but somewhere behind thick stone walls, a candle still burns. Inside, a monk hums low and steady, copying lines of Latin onto parchment, while a sister in the infirmary mixes honey with vinegar to soothe a patient's sores. A bell tolls. Not for prayer this time, but for death. Even in a world shattered by plague, the monasteries endured. Not untouched, not invincible, but different. Let's step now into these sacred silent sanctuaries, the places that straddled the line between divine devotion and practical healing, between retreat and resilience, and played an unforgettable role in how the Black Death unfolded. Monasteries before the plague, the rhythm of the cloister. Before the first whispers of plague, monasteries across Europe thrived as centers of worship, learning, healing charity. Monks and nuns followed the rule of Saint Benedict, or similar codes, rising before dawn, attending 8 daily services, eating simple meals in silence, and performing assigned duties, from gardening to manuscript copying to tending the sick. A monastery was a world unto itself, the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied by hand, the cloister, an open courtyard surrounded by arched walkways, the refectory, where meals were eaten in silence, the infirmary, where sick brothers and outsiders were treated, the herb garden, carefully cultivated for healing. These places weren't just spiritual centers, they were also repositories of knowledge. Monastic libraries held ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts on medicine, astronomy, and theology. Their herbal lore, passed down through centuries, remained some of the most sophisticated healing traditions of the time. But they were also deeply connected to the outside world. Monasteries fed the poor, hosted travelers, educated local children, and supported surrounding farms. And when the plague came, they were far from immune. The plague enters the cloister. As the Black Death began to spread, monasteries, with their close communal living and hospitality to the sick, became prime hotspots for infection. Some were devastated within weeks. Entire orders lost half or more of their members. In England, France, and Italy, monastic death rates were sometimes even higher than in cities because of their exposure to the sick and their refusal to abandon their duties. There are heartbreaking accounts from the time. In one convent, only one nun remained alive, caring for the others until she too succumbed. At a Carthusian monastery near London, all but one monk died, and he recorded their names until his hand could no longer hold the quill. In Avignon, seat of the Pope, monks dug mass graves for weeks, chanting prayers as they buried the clergy and laity side by side. And yet, not all monasteries fell. Some, in more isolated regions, enacted strict enclosure policies, cutting off all contact with the outside world. These places became accidental models of early quarantine. Some were spared entirely, living in eerie calm while the rest of the world screamed. Monastic medicine, herbs, honey, and hope. Long before modern hospitals, the monastic infirmary was one of the best places to get care, not because monks had modern knowledge, but because they had cleaner environments, structured routines, and a surprisingly sophisticated grasp of herbal treatments. Here are a few of the remedies and approaches they used. Honey and vinegar poultices for wounds and swellings. Thyme, sage, and garlic, used to make teas or salves with antimicrobial properties, even if they didn't know the term. Lavender and rose for calming anxiety and masking foul smells. Hot wine or ale infusions to ease fevers and chills. Clay tablets and charcoal to help with intestinal symptoms. Some monasteries maintained leech books, handwritten volumes listing herbs, recipes, and procedures passed from monk to monk. Importantly, monks also practiced basic hygiene, regular hand washing before meals and prayers, linen bandages cleaned and reused, simple isolation practices for very sick patients. These practices didn't cure the plague, but they sometimes slowed its spread. Monasteries also preserved medical texts from Arabic scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi, which offered more advanced theories of contagion and environmental factors, knowledge far ahead of its time in Europe. The spiritual response. Faith. Amid horror. The plague shook even the most devout to their core. Imagine living in a place devoted to prayer, and suddenly, despite constant chants, candles, fasts, and tears, the death toll only rises. Many monks and nuns believed the Black Death was a form of divine punishment. They redoubled their efforts, fasting more often, beating themselves in penance, holding all-night vigils in freezing chapels. Some wrote, "God has turned his face from us, and the darkness is without end." Others, however, interpreted the plague differently. They saw it not as punishment, but as a test of love, a chance to serve others until the very end. Monasteries opened their gates to the dying when no one else would. They fed the hungry, buried the dead, comforted the dying, and sang hymns at mass funerals. They didn't always survive, but their compassion became legendary. In Italy, France, and England, we have dozens of letters from bishops begging monks to continue their duties even as they were dying themselves. Some of those letters still exist, yellowed with time, written in careful Latin, with ink faded by tears. The healers, outside the walls. Not all healers lived in monasteries. In villages and towns, especially in remote areas, there were cunning folk, men and women who practiced folk medicine and were trusted for their herbal skill. These people were often semi-literate, using oral tradition and personal experience to treat. Fevers with willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid. Sores with boiled plantain leaves and comfrey. Anxiety with infusions of chamomile and valerian. Some were midwives, others were respected elders, and a few were accused of witchcraft, especially when their remedies failed. Still, during the plague, they were often the only help people had. There were also traveling healers who went from village to village offering charms, ointments, and holy relics, some genuine, many not. And finally, there were the hermits, men and women who lived in caves, huts, or forest chapels. Some were deeply spiritual, praying daily for the souls of the sick. Others became local legends, consulted by frightened families who offered eggs, wool, or bread in exchange for blessings or whispered cures. Hidden sanctuaries and safe havens. Though many monasteries were hit hard, a few became true sanctuaries during the plague, isolated places that offered peace, food, and relative safety. Some examples include remote mountain abbeys in the Alps and Pyrenees, island priories, where boats were refused and disease never arrived, deep woodland convents sustained by gardens and prayers. These places sometimes served as refuges for the wealthy or devout. Nobles might send their children to be sheltered behind cloister walls, or even join the order to escape the horrors outside. There are accounts of entire families taking monastic vows temporarily, hoping that by devoting themselves to God, they might be spared. Some succeeded. Others brought the plague with them. What was lost and what was preserved? The plague left scars everywhere, but in monasteries, those scars were deeply intellectual. Thousands of monks and scribes died, taking with them knowledge, texts, and entire traditions of learning. Manuscripts were left unfinished. Libraries collapsed into disuse. Some orders never recovered. Their lands were sold, their chapels left to ruin. But others adapted. In the years after the plague, monasteries began to copy more secular texts, to train new doctors, and even to support universities, blending the sacred and the scientific. They kept herbal lore alive. They recorded what they saw. And some of the earliest medical theories of contagion came from these cloistered minds, quietly writing by candlelight while the world outside burned. As the last echoes of the Black Death's deadly wave began to fade, the world was forever changed. But the story of the plague did not simply end with the deaths and despair. It continued on in the way societies remembered, adapted, and evolved. Understanding this aftermath is key to grasping not only the historical impact, but also the long shadow the Black Death cast over generations to come. First, it's important to recognize just how profound this demographic collapse was. Estimates suggest that somewhere between a third to half of Europe's population perished within just a few short years. Entire villages emptied, farms lay fallow, and once thriving towns became ghostly remnants of their former selves. This sudden and brutal loss left societies in shock, not just because of the scale of death, but because it touched nearly every family and community. The psychological weight of such an event was enormous, shaping the collective memory in ways that would linger for centuries. The immediate aftermath saw a world grappling with practical realities. With so many dead, labor was scarce, and this scarcity upended traditional economic and social structures. Survivors found themselves in a world with more resources per person, more land, more food, and most importantly, a stronger bargaining position. Peasants and laborers could demand better wages and conditions, shifting the centuries-old balance of power between them and the land-owning nobility. The rigid feudal system that had defined medieval life began to crumble, slowly giving way to new social dynamics and opportunities. But the plague's impact wasn't just economic. It sparked profound cultural and religious shifts as well. The Black Death challenged existing worldviews. If God was just, why had so many been taken? This question haunted survivors and shaped theological debate. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for human sins, while others questioned the very nature of faith. The Church, which had long been a central pillar of medieval life, faced criticism and a crisis of authority as it struggled to explain or control the catastrophe. The collective trauma found expression in art, literature, and ritual. From macabre depictions of death dancing through towns to somber prayers and masses for the dead, the plague permeated culture. This era gave rise to the Danse Macabre, a powerful artistic theme reminding all, peasants and nobles alike, of death's inevitability. Such imagery wasn't merely grim. It was a form of communal coping, a way to process loss and uncertainty. At the same time, medicine and science, limited as they were at the time, began to shift. Although true understanding of disease transmission would not emerge for centuries, the Black Death forced communities to experiment with quarantine measures, isolation, and sanitation, early roots of public health practices. Cities like Venice pioneered isolation hospitals, and some towns implemented cordon sanitaires, attempting to keep the disease at bay through enforced separation. These responses, born out of desperation, planted seeds for more modern approaches to epidemics. Survivors also carried with them stories and oral histories that shaped local traditions. Families recounted tales of lost loved ones, of miraculous escapes, and of strange, fearful nights when the sick were everywhere. These memories became part of communal identity, often blending history with myth, creating a rich tapestry of remembrance that informed everything from folklore to seasonal rituals. The demographic collapse also accelerated shifts in land use and agriculture. With fewer mouths to feed and less labor available, abandoned fields turned back to wilderness in some areas, while others saw innovation in farming methods to cope with the new realities. Crop rotations, the introduction of new tools, and adjustments in livestock management all arose from necessity, driving incremental changes in medieval economies. Politically, the Black Death shook the foundations of power. In some regions, revolts and uprisings erupted, fueled by rising tensions over wages, taxation, and the increasingly visible inequality between rich and poor. The social upheaval sparked by the plague forced rulers to reconsider policies, laws, and governance structures, though progress was uneven and often met with resistance. Throughout the aftermath, the Black Death remained a cautionary tale and a reference point for centuries. Plague outbreaks would recur in waves over the next few hundred years, each time evoking the memory of that first terrifying pandemic. Writers, historians, and clergy kept the story alive, not just as a record of death, but as a lesson on human frailty, resilience, and the unpredictable nature of life. In a sense, the Black Death acted as a dark mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of medieval society, exposing weaknesses but also prompting adaptation and change. Its impact rippled beyond Europe too, influencing trade networks, diplomacy, and cross-cultural interactions as societies rebuilt and sought stability. So when we reflect on the aftermath of the Black Death, we see more than just a grim chapter of death. We see the seeds of transformation, economic shifts, cultural evolutions, early public health measures, and new social orders that would pave the way into the Renaissance and beyond. The legacy of the plague is complex, layered, and enduring, a testament to humanity's capacity to endure even the darkest nights. The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. While it brought unimaginable suffering, it also profoundly reshaped medicine and public health in Europe and beyond. Before the plague, medical knowledge was limited, heavily influenced by ancient theories and superstition. But the sheer scale of the crisis forced societies to confront their vulnerabilities and rethink how disease was understood and managed. Let's explore that transformation in depth. Medical understanding before the Black Death humoral theory. Dominance. For centuries, medicine was governed by the humoral theory from Hippocrates and Galen. Health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease was thought to be caused by imbalances, often linked to environmental factors or moral failings. Superstition and religion. Medicine was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, and many treatments involved prayers, relics, and rituals. Limited practical knowledge. Surgery was rudimentary, with limited anesthesia or hygiene. Herbal remedies and bloodletting were common, but often ineffective. Hospitals were rare and mostly served the poor or pilgrims. The shock of the plague unprecedented scale. The rapid spread and high mortality rates of the Black Death shattered old medical assumptions. Traditional treatments failed spectacularly. Physicians were helpless, as entire towns were wiped out in months. Questioning authority. The plague undermined trust in established medical authorities and traditional teachings. People began to seek alternative explanations and remedies, opening the door to new thinking. Early public health responses. Quarantine origins. One of the most lasting legacies of the Black Death was the introduction of quarantine. The city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, famously required ships to anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni, before unloading cargo to prevent plague spread. This idea spread to other ports and cities, Isolation and lazarettos. Isolation of the sick became a standard practice. Lazarettos, or quarantine stations, were established to separate the infected from the healthy. These early public health measures were crude but effective. Travel restrictions and sanitation efforts. Cities began restricting movement and improving sanitation. Some forbade public gatherings, burned contaminated clothing, or regulated waste disposal. Changes in medical practice and education. Rise of empiricism. The plague pushed doctors toward more observation and experience-based knowledge. Physicians began keeping records of symptoms and outcomes, laying groundwork for scientific medicine. Anatomical studies. The post-plague period saw increased interest in human anatomy, leading to more dissections and better understanding of the body. This shift would eventually fuel the Renaissance in medicine. Medical schools and universities. Institutions like the University of Padua grew in importance as centers for medical learning and research, slowly moving away from purely ancient texts. Social and cultural impact on medicine. Doctors and surgeons. The distinction between physicians, theorists, and surgeons, practical healers, became clearer. Surgeons gained respect as their hands-on skills were crucial in treating plague symptoms and wounds. Rise of barber surgeons. Barber surgeons, who performed minor surgeries and tooth extractions, became more common, reflecting a democratization of medical services. Public fear and demand for remedies. Desperation led to a booming market in charlatan remedies and folk medicine, but also to increased calls for regulation and professional standards. Long-term public health developments. Municipal health boards. Some cities established health boards to oversee sanitation, quarantine, and medical care, precursors to modern public health departments. Vital records and surveillance. Keeping track of deaths and disease outbreaks became more systematic, an early form of epidemiology. Foundation for later advances. The lessons of the plague paved the way for future advances in vaccination, microbiology, and public health infrastructure centuries later. The Black Death in different regions. Europe versus Asia versus Middle East. The mid-14th century marked one of the deadliest chapters in human history, the Black Death. While often closely tied to Europe in popular memory, this devastating pandemic was a truly global catastrophe, affecting vast regions of Asia and the Middle East as well. The story of the Black Death's spread, its varied impacts, and the diverse responses it provoked are complex and illuminating, revealing much about the interconnectedness of medieval societies and their resilience, or vulnerability, in the face of unimaginable crisis. Origins and early spread in Asia. The Black Death is generally believed to have originated in Central Asia, particularly in the arid steppes and trade hubs along the Silk Road. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, responsible for the plague, likely thrived in populations of wild rodents living in these regions, and from there, it found its way into human settlements through fleas hitching rides on rats. The Mongol Empire, which spanned much of Asia and connected the East to the West, played a significant role in facilitating the plague's movement. The extensive trade networks, military campaigns, and population displacements that characterized the Mongol period inadvertently created a perfect storm for infectious disease transmission. Historical records suggest that by the early 1330s, plague outbreaks had begun in various parts of Central Asia. Towns such as the bustling city of Samarkand, a key Silk Road nexus, experienced waves of sickness that would later ripple outward. From these initial epicenters, the disease spread eastward into China and westward towards the Middle East. In China, the plague struck with fierce intensity. The Yuan dynasty, already strained by internal conflict, heavy taxation, and natural disasters, found itself overwhelmed. While precise records are scarce, contemporary accounts describe massive population losses and widespread social disruption, especially in northern regions like Beijing and the surrounding provinces. The disease spread through both urban centers and rural villages, moving along rivers, trade routes, and caravan trails. The impact on Chinese society was multifaceted. Economically, the loss of laborers disrupted agricultural production and trade. Socially, families were decimated, and entire communities abandoned their homes. Despite the devastation, some local governments attempted quarantine measures and rudimentary public health interventions, but these efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. Spread to the Middle East. From Central Asia, the Black Death moved westward into the Middle East, a region marked by a rich tapestry of cultures, religions, and thriving trade cities. The plague entered through key trading hubs such as Tabriz in modern-day Iran, and then spread along the caravan routes connecting the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Major cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became hotspots of infection. The dense urban environments, bustling markets, and cosmopolitan populations of these centers were ripe for rapid disease transmission. The Middle Eastern response to the plague combined religious interpretation with practical measures. Many saw the plague as a divine punishment and responded with increased piety, prayer, and acts of charity. Public health efforts varied. Some cities closed their gates to travelers, others tried quarantines or isolated the sick, while many continued business as usual until overwhelmed by the toll. The disruption was profound. Economic activity slowed drastically, especially trade and agriculture, and political instability increased as rulers struggled to maintain order. However, some cities managed to recover relatively quickly, while others suffered lasting decline. Arrival and devastation in Europe. Europe's encounter with the Black Death began around 1347, when plague-infested ships docked in the Sicilian port of Messina. From there, the disease spread rapidly across the continent, traveling along trade routes, rivers, and even military campaigns. Europeans faced the plague with little understanding of its cause or transmission. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Theories ranged from miasma, bad air, to divine punishment, and treatments were often ineffective or harmful. The mortality rates were staggering. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished in just a few years, with some regions hit harder than others. Cities like Florence, London, and Paris lost massive portions of their inhabitants. Rural areas were not spared. Whole villages were wiped out or abandoned. Socially, the plague reshaped Europe. Labor shortages empowered peasants to demand better conditions, fueling social unrest and shifts in the feudal order. The church's authority was challenged as it failed to protect the populace or provide solace, contributing to long-term religious and cultural shifts. Differences across Europe. While the Black Death was devastating everywhere, its effects varied widely across Europe. Coastal Mediterranean cities, with frequent trade and maritime traffic, often experienced faster and earlier outbreaks, while more isolated regions in Eastern Europe saw delayed arrival and sometimes lower mortality. Northern Europe faced harsher winters and different living conditions that affected disease transmission patterns. The diversity of languages, customs, and governance also influenced how communities responded, ranging from panic and flight to quarantine and social reform. Some communities embraced scapegoating, persecuting minorities such as Jews, blaming them for poisoning wells or spreading disease. This tragic aspect of the plague reflects the fear and desperation of the time. Cultural and medical responses in the Middle East. The Middle East had a long tradition of medical scholarship, building on Greek, Roman, and Islamic knowledge. Physicians like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, had laid foundations for understanding disease centuries earlier, yet the Black Death challenged existing frameworks. In response, medical practitioners employed a variety of treatments, from herbal remedies and bloodletting to quarantine practices inspired by earlier experiences with contagious diseases. The plague also spurred innovations in public health policy, including the establishment of quarantine stations known as lazarettos in port cities. Religious leaders emphasized spiritual remedies, urging repentance and charity, while some mystical sects gained popularity amid the crisis. The cultural impact was profound, influencing art, literature, and philosophy as people grappled with mortality and divine will, recovery, and long-term legacies. The aftermath of the Black Death in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe shaped the course of history. Population losses led to labor shortages that shifted economic power toward workers and peasants. Trade networks were disrupted but eventually re-established, often with new safeguards. The trauma of the plague inspired changes in medicine, hygiene, and social organization. In Europe, the decline of feudalism and the rise of more centralized states were partly accelerated by the demographic and social upheavals. In the Middle East and Asia, the plague contributed to shifts in political power, urban development, and cultural transformation. The Silk Road's importance waned temporarily, as fear of contagion reduced long-distance travel. But the region's interconnectedness remained crucial. The story of the Black Death begins not in Europe, but deep in the vast steppes of Central Asia, regions that today encompass parts of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Western China. These areas were home to nomadic tribes, bustling caravan cities, and wild rodent populations that served as the natural reservoir for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. The plague bacterium circulates primarily in fleas that parasitize rodents, especially the great gerbil and marmots found in these steppe regions. These rodents lived in burrows, and their dense colonies provided an ideal environment for flea populations to flourish. When climatic conditions such as drought or cold disrupted rodent populations, fleas sought new hosts, often humans, triggering outbreaks. By the early 1330s, plague outbreaks were reported near the city of Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan, a hub along the Silk Road trade route. The Mongol Empire, spanning most of Asia and linking China to the Middle East and Europe, facilitated trade and travel across this massive area. It also inadvertently created a pathway for the plague's rapid expansion. Mongol armies, with their mass troop movements and sieges, helped spread the disease across vast distances. One infamous incident involved the siege of the Genoese trading city of Kaffa, now Feodosia in Crimea, in 1346, where, according to some accounts, Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city. This gruesome tactic likely accelerated the disease's jump into Europe via Genoese traders fleeing the siege by sea. In China, the plague first struck the northern regions under the rule of the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan. Chinese chroniclers documented devastating outbreaks in Beijing and along the Yellow River Basin, where farming communities were hit hard. The plague exacerbated existing famines and unrest, weakening Yuan authority and contributing to the dynasty's eventual collapse in 1368. Local Chinese doctors and officials responded by implementing quarantine measures in some areas, restricting movement and burning contaminated clothing. Despite this, the dense population and frequent trade traffic made containment nearly impossible. The Silk Road caravan routes remained active but perilous, carrying not only goods like silk, spices, and precious metals, but also the invisible menace of plague. merchants and pilgrims traveling between Central Asia, Persia, and India risked exposure with every journey. Societal impact in Asia. The societal consequences of the plague in Asia were profound. The population decline was uneven but significant. In some areas, entire villages were abandoned, leading to the reforestation of farmland and disruption of local economies. The loss of manpower in agrarian communities caused food shortages and inflation. Trade, the lifeblood of the Silk Road cities, faltered. Cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Bukhara, once vibrant centers of commerce and culture, experienced sharp declines in population and wealth. Merchants faced higher risks, forcing some to alter trade routes or reduce travel. The plague also had political ramifications. The Yuan dynasty, already struggling with internal corruption and rebellion, was further weakened. The decline in tax revenue and administrative capacity contributed to their eventual overthrow by the Ming dynasty. Culturally, the plague left a deep imprint on Asian societies. Literary works from the period reflect themes of mortality, divine wrath, and social chaos. Some Buddhist and Taoist sects gained influence by promising spiritual protection or enlightenment amid widespread despair. Spread and impact in the Middle East expanded. As the plague moved westward from Central Asia, it reached the Middle East through key nodes of commerce and culture. Persian cities like Tabriz, Isfahan, and Shiraz were among the first to be affected, serving as major stopping points on caravan routes. From Persia, the disease spread to Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt, regions with large urban populations and significant trade networks linking Africa, Europe, and Asia. Major urban centers in the Middle East were hit hard. Baghdad, once the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate and a renowned intellectual hub, suffered devastating losses. Though the city had experienced earlier plagues, the Black Death overwhelmed its infrastructure. Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, vital commercial cities with diverse populations, also saw widespread mortality. Cairo, the largest city in the Islamic world at the time, faced a prolonged plague outbreak in the late 1340s. The Middle Eastern response was shaped by a blend of religious interpretation and medical tradition. Islamic scholars and physicians referred to earlier works by Galen and Avicenna, combining spiritual and practical remedies. Some cities implemented quarantine protocols at port gates and caravanserais, inns for travelers. Sultans and local rulers issued public health edicts, restricting movement and ordering the burial of the dead in mass graves. Religious leaders preached about the plague as a test from God, encouraging repentance and charity. Simultaneously, some mystic groups gained followers, promising spiritual protection or claiming the plague was a divine sign of impending transformation. Trade slowed drastically, but did not come to a complete halt. Merchants adapted by limiting travel or shifting routes, but the interconnectedness of the region meant the plague's impact reverberated widely. Detailed medical and cultural responses in the Middle East. The Middle East had a rich tradition of medical scholarship, and the plague spurred both continuity and innovation in this field. Hospitals, bimaristans, in cities like Cairo and Damascus, though overwhelmed, continued to serve the sick. Physicians employed treatments such as herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and fumigation of homes. Though limited by contemporary medical knowledge, these practices reflected attempts to understand and combat the disease. Quarantine, known as al-azla, was practiced in some places, inspired by Islamic teachings emphasizing community health and prevention. The cultural impact was immense. Art and literature from the period often depicted themes of death and divine judgment. Poets like Ibn al-Khatib wrote detailed observations on the plague's symptoms and spread, providing valuable historical insights. Arrival and first impacts. A different entry point. While the plague likely entered Europe through Genoese trade ships fleeing from the Crimean port of Kaffa, modern-day Theodosia, the Black Death's arrival in the Middle East was less theatrical, though no less devastating. It likely spread through commercial and pilgrimage routes, particularly the Silk Road and the bustling Red Sea and Persian Gulf maritime networks. By 1347, plague had already begun to seep into the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coastline, reaching cities such as Acre, Damascus, and Gaza by late 1348. From there, it surged east and south. Cairo, a thriving metropolis and one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world, was struck not long after. It is estimated that hundreds of people died there each day at the height of the plague. Some chroniclers report burial pits so vast that bodies had to be layered with lime before new corpses could be added. Alexandria, one of Egypt's great trading cities, reportedly lost up to 200,000 people, a number difficult to fully verify, but consistent with the sheer demographic collapse seen across the region. As the disease spread into the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, modern-day Iran, and parts of Mesopotamia, no region was spared. And yet, how people understood and reacted to the plague varied greatly, shaped by religious doctrine, historical memory, and community structures, theological interpretation, and spiritual response. In the Middle East, Islamic theology played a profound role in shaping how people interpreted the plague. Islamic scholars and jurists were confronted with a terrifying and deeply existential question. Was this a punishment from God, or was it a test of faith? Many turned to the Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, to seek clarity. A commonly cited Hadith described the plague as a rahmah, mercy for the faithful and a punishment for others. It instructed Muslims not to flee a land afflicted by plague and not to enter one where it had spread, an early form of quarantine guidance long before modern germ theory. This theological approach gave the faithful a framework to understand suffering. It was not meaningless chaos, but part of a divine plan. For many, this brought a sense of solace, even if it did not ease the physical pain. It also encouraged communal prayer, introspection, and moral reform. Mosques remained central gathering points, not only for religious practice, but for spiritual consolation. Yet not all agreed on the interpretation. Some clerics preached that the plague was a direct punishment for sins, for pride, corruption, injustice. Others pushed back, urging the faithful to see it as an unavoidable test, something beyond human comprehension. These differing views created a lively theological discourse, one that highlighted the flexibility and depth of Islamic scholarship in responding to crisis, medical understanding and responses. Contrary to some stereotypes, the Islamic world in the 14th century was highly advanced in medical knowledge. Centuries of scholarship, from Ibn Sina, Avicenna, to Al-Razi, Rhazes, had developed a robust medical tradition rooted in observation, diagnosis, and public health. Although physicians in the Middle East, like their European counterparts, did not understand bacteria or the true cause of plague, they had sophisticated theories of contagion. Many believed that bad air, miasma, was responsible and took steps to purify environments, burning incense, using perfumes, and ventilating homes. Hospitals in major cities like Cairo and Damascus attempted to isolate the sick and care for them. These were not makeshift tents, but well-established institutions that had existed for centuries, often with dedicated wards for different illnesses. The plague overwhelmed many of them, of course, but the infrastructure itself reflected a society deeply invested in health and healing. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to dietary changes, and even bloodletting, although there was significant debate about whether such interventions were helpful or harmful. Quarantine in the modern sense was unevenly practiced, but some towns did attempt to isolate infected neighborhoods or restrict movement. Urban versus rural, who suffered more? As in Europe, cities bore the brunt of the initial devastation. The dense urban populations of Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Aleppo created ideal conditions for the disease to spread rapidly. Traders, soldiers, scholars, and pilgrims all moved between cities, unknowingly ferrying the plague with them. In contrast, rural areas were not entirely spared, but often saw a slower spread, sometimes with lower mortality rates. This was due to lower population density and fewer outside contacts. However, when plague did strike isolated villages, the lack of medical care and food supplies often made outcomes worse. Some rural communities simply disappeared. Others saw a strange reversal. As people fled cities in fear, rural populations in certain areas briefly swelled, disrupting local economies and creating tensions over food and shelter. Cultural and intellectual shifts. One of the most profound effects of the Black Death in the Middle East was cultural. While Europe would later see a renaissance fueled in part by post-plague transformations, the Middle East saw a more complex set of reactions. In the wake of the plague, some scholars turned inward, producing rich theological and philosophical texts grappling with mortality, divine justice, and the meaning of human suffering. Sufi mystics, in particular, wrote powerful poetry and treatises on the transience of life and the eternity of the soul. There was also a growing concern with moral decay. Chroniclers of the time often wrote not just about the physical symptoms of plague, but about the decay of society. Tales of injustice, greed, and social breakdown. Some believed the plague was divine retribution for the abandonment of righteous paths. Others saw it as an unavoidable cycle of history. In some regions, art and architecture slowed. In others, they flourished, as rulers and elites commissioned mosques, schools, and mausoleums in an attempt to leave a legacy or appease divine wrath. Social restructuring and political impact. The political implications of the Black Death were immense. The Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled over much of Egypt and the Levant, suffered a severe blow to its administrative apparatus. So many soldiers, scribes, tax collectors, and artisans perished that the basic functions of government were strained. Succession crises emerged. Local governors seized more power. Peasant uprisings flared in certain areas as food prices soared and wages collapsed. The balance between urban elites, religious leaders, and common folk began to shift, not always in predictable ways. In Persia, under the declining Ilkhanate, the plague accelerated the disintegration of Mongol rule. New dynasties would rise from the ashes, but the vacuum left by plague-ravaged leadership would linger for decades. Even pilgrimage to Mecca was affected. The Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, saw dramatically reduced participation during plague years. In some cases, the pilgrimage was suspended altogether. This interruption underscored the severity of the crisis, for nothing short of immense danger could deter the faithful from making the sacred journey. Burial and the landscape of grief. The scale of death in the Middle East led to rapid changes in how communities dealt with burial. Islamic tradition emphasizes prompt burial and ritual washing of the dead. But when dozens or even hundreds died each day, these customs became impossible to maintain. Mass graves became common, particularly on the outskirts of cities. Religious scholars issued fatwas, legal rulings, permitting altered burial practices, allowing for group burials, abbreviated washing, and even prayers from afar. These adaptations reflected a deep respect for the dead, even in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Grief was collective. Mosques held frequent funerals. Families erected simple markers, many of which have been lost to time. Poetry and prose from this period often reflect a tone of melancholy, reflection, and longing, not just for loved ones, but for a world that seemed to be unraveling. Endurance and legacy. The Black Death did not break the Islamic world, but it changed it. It prompted theological debate, public health innovation, and societal reordering. Cities would rebuild, trade would resume, faith would endure. Perhaps most remarkably, many in the Middle East emerged from the plague not with bitterness or nihilism, but with renewed purpose. They built schools, copied manuscripts, rebuilt irrigation systems, and passed on stories. Stories of loss, yes, but also of endurance, compassion, and faith. The plague was a fire that burned through the Middle East, but it left behind not only ashes, it also forged new steel. By the time the last wave of the Black Death ebbed from the shorelines of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the world was no longer the same. The plague had passed through the cities and villages like an invisible army, silent but merciless. It had struck with such speed, such indifference, that to those who survived, it often felt as though the natural order had collapsed entirely. But as devastating as the Black Death was, claiming tens of millions of lives, it was not the end. It was a breaking point, yes, but also a turning point. And in that, it revealed something powerful about what it means to be human. This conclusion is not merely a summing up. It is a meditation on the long shadow of the Black Death, how it reshaped societies, minds, economies, and hearts. And most of all, how people survived. Not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. This is a story of what came after. A world forever changed. When we look at the medieval world before the plague, we see a tapestry already rich in color and complexity. Cities hummed with trade, scholarship, prayer, and labor. Kingdoms clashed and rose, empires governed vast swathes of land, and peasants toiled under systems ancient and slow to change. The plague tore through that tapestry. It didn't just fray the edges, it unraveled the center. Populations collapsed. In Europe alone, up to 50% of the population perished in just a few short years. The Middle East and parts of Asia saw similarly staggering losses. In some regions, entire villages vanished. Cemeteries expanded like scars across the landscape. Streets went quiet. Laborers, merchants, monks, children, midwives, teachers, and kings. The plague knew no distinction. But in the empty spaces left behind, something remarkable began to happen. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily. Human beings, even grieving, frightened, and worn down, adapted. And from the ashes, they began to rebuild. A rebirth of labor and class dynamics. The first and perhaps most immediately visible change came in the relationship between labor and wealth. With so many dead, the surviving workers found themselves in a rare position of bargaining power. In Europe, the feudal system, a centuries-old hierarchy of lords, vassals, and serfs, was deeply shaken. Fields lay fallow. Landowners begged for workers. Wages rose. Peasants moved more freely between towns and employers. In England, the aftermath of the plague helped spark events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In Italy, city-states saw their merchant classes grow in power as traditional noble families struggled to maintain their influence. In France and Germany, entire towns reorganized labor relations, creating new systems of taxation, guild regulation, and urban employment. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, The death of bureaucrats, artisans, and soldiers led to administrative reforms and the empowerment of certain regional powers. In Persia, the weakening of the Ilkhanate opened the door to new dynasties. In Egypt, the Mamluks restructured their military and political elite. Across all of these places, a similar pattern emerged. The social order, once considered eternal, was malleable after all, and for many, that realization changed everything. The expansion of public health thinking. The Black Death also triggered a slow but undeniable revolution in the concept of public health. While modern germ theory was still centuries away, people across continents had witnessed the raw power of disease and began to rethink how to prepare for it. In Italy, port cities like Venice established early forms of quarantine. The quarantina, a 40-day isolation period for ships arriving from plague-affected areas. These measures would evolve into formal public health boards, complete with plague doctors, city inspectors, and protocols for isolation. In the Islamic world, traditions of hygiene and cleanliness rooted in religious practice began to intersect with evolving medical thought. While some scholars emphasized divine will, others promoted more proactive approaches, advocating for fresh air, limited contact, and organized care centers. Public health became, for perhaps the first time in global history, a civic concern, not just a private matter or spiritual affliction. This was a profound shift. Cities began designing systems not just for wealth, trade, or war, but for survival, grief, memory, and collective trauma. Perhaps no change was deeper or more enduring than the psychic wound the Black Death left behind. Across languages and religions, the 14th century became a time of mourning, not just for the dead, but for a world lost. In Europe, art turned inward. The Danse Macabre, a recurring motif in post-plague art, showed skeletons dancing with peasants and kings alike, a grim reminder of death's equality. Tombs were engraved with corpses, not saints. Writers like Boccaccio penned stories that both satirized and sanctified the human condition, reflecting on the absurdity and fragility of life. In the Islamic world, Sufi poets and theologians poured grief into verse. The impermanence of life, a key tenet of Islamic spirituality, took on new urgency. Some scholars wrote extensively about the moral lessons of plague, urging humility, prayer, and reflection. In Asia, particularly China, where records are more fragmented, we find hints of similar grief: collapsed dynasties, abandoned temples, deserted villages. The trauma may not have always been recorded, but it echoed in lost generations and altered customs. We often imagine trauma as an individual burden, but in the wake of the Black Death, trauma became collective, and the stories, songs, rituals, and architecture of the post-plague world reflect that shared scar. Faith, shaken and strengthened. The role of faith in the plague years was paradoxical. For some, the horror of the plague undermined their trust in religious institutions. In Europe, the church lost credibility in some eyes. Unable to prevent or explain the disease, its authority was questioned. Flagellant movements, heresies, and anti-clerical sentiments gained traction. Yet for others, faith became the anchor that allowed them to endure. In the Middle East, despite debates among scholars, Islam provided many with a spiritual explanation and solace. Martyrdom for plague victims became a popular concept, offering hope amid chaos. In both the Christian and Muslim worlds, new religious movements flourished. In Europe, mystics and reformers called for purer forms of worship. In the Middle East, Sufi orders gained strength, offering personal, emotional forms of spirituality in the face of institutional breakdown. The plague did not destroy religion. If anything, it deepened it, making it more personal, more desperate, more reflective. Faith, whether shaken or strengthened, remained central. Legacy in knowledge and innovation. Perhaps surprisingly, the plague years also served as a strange kind of catalyst for intellectual and artistic development. In Europe, universities had been decimated by death, but new forms of knowledge soon surged in their place. Interest in anatomy, astronomy, and mathematics grew. The early stirrings of the Renaissance, though not caused by the plague, were undoubtedly shaped by it. In medicine, the plague left behind a hunger for better explanations. Though often hampered by limited understanding, physicians began recording symptoms more meticulously, comparing treatments and refining hospital practices. The seeds of modern medicine were being quietly sown in these grim years. In the Islamic world, too, new treatises were written, some practical, others philosophical. Debates raged about the nature of contagion, divine will, and ethical care. These texts would continue to influence medical thinking for centuries, and in Asia, shifts in governance, military tactics, and trade reflected lessons learned during the chaos. While recovery was uneven, the eventual emergence of new powers, like the Ming Dynasty, carried forward changes that were rooted, in part, in post-plague restructuring. The human spirit, enduring through the ages. Ultimately, what we take from the story of the Black Death is not just about numbers, or tombstones, or disrupted dynasties. It is about the human spirit. This plague was not the first to devastate the world. It would not be the last. But in its wake, it revealed the layers of endurance built into the human story. Mothers who buried children still planted gardens. Monks who lost their abbots still copied sacred texts by candlelight. Farmers returned to their fields. Merchants reopened stalls. Artists sketched new visions. Life, though smaller and sadder for a time, kept going. And across cultures, across languages, people tried to make sense of it, to record it, to warn future generations, to say, we lived, we lost, but we did not vanish. The human spirit, enduring through the ages. Ultimately, what we take from the story of the Black Death is not just about numbers, or tombstones, or disrupted dynasties. It is about the human spirit. This plague was not the first to devastate the world. It would not be the last. But in its wake, it revealed the layers of endurance built into the human story. Mothers who buried children still planted gardens. Monks who lost their abbots still copied sacred texts by candlelight. Farmers returned to their fields. Merchants reopened stalls. Artists sketched new visions. Life, though smaller and sadder for a time, kept going. And across cultures, across languages, people tried to make sense of it, to record it, to warn future generations, to say, we lived, we lost, but we did not vanish. Echoes for today. Standing in our own century, the story of the Black Death feels more than just historical. It is, in some ways, familiar. We too have faced global disease, confusion, and mourning. We too have asked how systems could fail, and how they could be rebuilt. We too have learned that loss is not evenly distributed, that survival is not guaranteed, and that the human response to crisis is always complex. But we have also learned, like those before us, that communities matter, that knowledge evolves, that compassion is powerful, and that even in the darkest times, humans create new systems, new stories, new beginnings. The Black Death was one of history's deadliest events, but it was also, strangely, a mirror. It showed us who we were and who we could become, and in that mirror, across centuries, we still see the glint of resilience.